Yeah, thank you very much. I must admit it causes some stress to me to speak after two such inspiring presentations and before the conference dinner, but well, we'll see. First of all, congratulations to a great conference and the attempt to demonstrate the relevance of gender aspects for basically all fields of macroeconomics and macroeconomic policy. And I think that in this regard, in many others probably too, the conference is really a big success. So thank you for organizing that, and many thanks also for inviting me to speak in this plenary session. It's a great honor for me to be here. My presentation will focus on public finances, which, as you all know, is a very broad field. So therefore, in the next 25 minutes or so, I will talk about three selected areas within public finances that are relevant for equitable growth in general and also from a gender perspective. I will start with some, very briefly, background, and will then address three selected issues. The first one is taxes and gender, and I think this fits quite well without too many overlaps with what Karen was presenting right now. The second issue I will address is the greening of public finances and gender. The third one, very briefly, but I think it's important because it's such a hot topic at the moment, is fiscal consolidation and gender. And I will close with the identification, very briefly, of several research gaps. And I think that's also a nice addition to that what Karen already presented. Let me start with some background. Very briefly, we see persistent, and my focus is not on low and middle income countries, but it's more on European countries. We see persistent socioeconomic gender gaps that are more or less pronounced across countries, but they can be observed almost everywhere, and I think they are relevant for my three selected issues. At first, we have a very still pronounced horizontal and vertical labor market segregations. We have gender gaps in incomes with regard to wages, capital incomes, and pensions. We have gender gaps in consumption behavior, preferences, needs, not only but also due to the gender division of labor and responsibilities. We have gender gaps in poverty risks, in wealth, in inheritances, in unpaid work. We have gendered mobility patterns, and health and long-term care are characterized by gender gaps regarding women and men as caregivers, as well as receivers of care and health services. I also want to remind you that public sectors are rather large in the European Union, different from lower and middle income countries. If we measure them with the relevant government ratios, on average across the EU, I brought you the latest data from the Commission's economic forecast. Total revenue and percent of GDP reaches on average almost 45% of GDP. Tax ratios range between 35 and 40% of GDP. Expenditure ratios lie between 45 and 50% of GDP. And this, of course, implies that government finances can act as a very powerful lever to support or to impede gender equality. In particular, and of course, equitable growth in general. What has also become, unfortunately, rather relevant again in recent years is that debt and deficit ratios have been on the rise on average across the EU, and in many countries don't comply with the EU fiscal rules, obviously, which implies the need for fiscal consolidation in a lot of EU member countries after the multiple crises that we experienced in the last few years. So let me now have a closer look at my first selected area, namely taxes and gender. There are multiple relevant gender effects of taxes. The traditional dimensions that have been addressed more or less extensively in the literature include incentives effects regarding work incentives with regard to the participation decision and the decision about the number of working hours. And taxes shape, of course, also incentives for the intra-household allocation of paid and unpaid work. In addition, there are gender-differentiated distributional effects due to the gender income gaps I already due to the gender wealth and inheritance gaps, and due to the gender differences in consumption behavior. Taxes shape work incentives and influence the intra-household allocation of paid and unpaid work, as we know from a large body of empirical evidence. We know that average labor tax rates impact the participation decision. Marginal labor tax rates have an influence on the decision on working hours. The system of household taxation in income taxation influences the allocation of paid and unpaid work between spouses. A splitting system, which is still applied in Germany, influences or bears incentives for a male breadwinner model. Relevant are also the tax consequences of an unequal intra-household allocation of paid and unpaid work. Tax privileges for overtime, for example, or non-contributory co-insurance in health insurance. All these are incentives that more or less support also a male breadwinner model. On the other hand, tax deductions for childcare expenditures can support labor market participation. For the second parent, obviously, mostly these are the mothers, as they decrease the opportunity cost of entering paid employment. And finally, consumption taxes play a role. The higher they are, the higher the incentives for the production of the affected goods and services within the household instead of purchasing them on the market. Here you see, in a nutshell, more or less, some stylized gender-differentiated distributional effects of taxes. Karen addressed some of them already. We can expect an increase of gender inequality with the rise of regressive taxes and levies, particularly consumption taxes, but also social security contributions, and the dualization of income taxation. That means progressive taxation of labor income on the one hand, and a flat and rather moderate taxation of capital incomes on the other hand, that we observe practically in almost all EU countries. On the other hand, a decrease of gender inequality is brought about by progressive income taxation, and also, of course, obviously by taxes on wealth, inheritances, and capital income. There are several gender-relevant long-run taxation trends that can be observed across the EU. Some of them are gender inequality increasing, the low and the decreasing weight of wealth-based taxes, obviously the dualization of income taxation, the reduction of capital income tax rates, the reduction of top income tax rates, the increase of regular VAT rates that we have observed in a number of European countries, and the extension of carbon taxation for basic needs, for example, for heating. Other long-run trends are gender inequality decreasing, the individualization of income taxation that has taken part in almost all EU countries in the last decades, the reduction of taxes on low labor incomes, the extension of some reduced VAT rates, where I would like to put a question mark behind that. I very much appreciated what you said about the tampon taxes that are very much praised in the EU. I'm not really sure about that, if they really merit that praise, I don't know. And recently we also observe some increase of capital income tax rates and an extension of carbon taxation for certain activities, for example, air travels that are more dominated by men. Let me finally sketch some selected elements of gender-sensitive tax systems, and I think this is not really contradicting what you said, Karen, before. To strengthen work incentives, we need individualized income tax systems, or we should try to reduce taxes for lower labor incomes, which could support labor market participation, as well as the tax deductibility of childcare costs, whereby I think it's better to have tax credits instead of tax allowances due to their distributional impact. To reduce after-tax gender income and wealth gaps, individualized income tax systems should be individualized. uniform progressive taxation of all income sources, regardless whether they are capital or labor incomes, should be implemented. Wealth-based taxation should be strengthened. And also I think it's important to assess and then, of course, also to reform tax exemptions that have a regressive distributional effect. And also such tax exemption that benefit men more than women, for example, tax allowances in personal income tax or reduced VAT rates for certain goods and services. And I also think it's important to set corrective taxes right. That means to set them equal to the externalities they cause, for example, for tobacco and alcohol, because otherwise men who consume more tobacco and alcohol are kind of tax privileged compared to women. So my second issue, and don't be afraid of this graph, I won't address it in detail, but my second issue is the greening of public finances and gender. And what this graph tries to do is to illustrate all areas that are relevant when we talk about the greening of public finances. And obviously all these areas also include a gender dimension, which has received, at least in my perception, relatively little attention in the literature, yes. Instead of addressing all these areas, I will focus on relevant gender differentiated effects of environmental taxes, which have not been, at least again in my perception, been researched extensively yet. Incentive or rather disincentive effects of environmental taxes are directed at the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, of noise pollution, air pollution, fine dust, use of resources, for example, soil, etc. And we can assume that there are gender differences in the elasticity of demand due to differing preferences, needs, environmental awareness, etc. for environmentally harmful activities, and therefore the effectiveness, and we don't have a lot of research there, but I think that would merit more research because I would assume that the effectiveness of environmental taxes may differ across men and women. And it's also plausible to assume gender differentiated distributional effects of environmental taxes due to the gender income and wealth gaps, due to socio-demographic gender differences, for example, the choice of residence, due to gender differences, and we know that from the empirical literature that there are gender differences in environmental awareness. And there are also gender differences in demand and consumption behavior, which result from gender differences in the division of labor and responsibilities, and also gender differences in consumption preferences, conspicuous consumption, dietary habits, etc., play a role here. We also know that from the empirical literature. Let me address some aspects regarding potential gender differentiated effects of carbon taxes. We observe gendered consumption patterns for carbon-intensive goods and services. Sometimes this is called the eco-gender gap in the literature. Men consume, for example, more carbon-intensive transport services, foodstuff, etc. The opportunities for behavioral changes differ between men and women in terms of financial means to adapt, in terms of the time required and available to adapt, and also due to the division of labor. Regarding the employment in carbon-intensive sectors, men are overrepresented, and they could be affected overproportionately accordingly through tax-induced increase to a tax-induced increase of production costs and wage decreases. At the same time, men, or regarding the employment in green sectors, in many green sectors, men are overrepresented as well. So they might benefit overproportionately through the growth of green sectors that are induced by climate measures, for example, carbon taxes. Also, the use of carbon tax revenue is relevant from a gender perspective. There are several possible uses of carbon tax revenues. One is to use carbon tax revenues for compensation mechanisms, for example, for lump sum payments to households, or green subsidies for households to support climate-friendly behavior. Another option is to decrease other taxes or levies to kind of pay back these carbon tax revenues to households or firms. And another option is to invest the carbon tax revenues in green projects, for example, a climate-friendly infrastructure. And of course, and very obviously, all these options have gendered and different, probably gendered effects. And finally, also, what is relevant is that the impact of negative environmental externalities or tax-induced positive environmental effects may differ between men and women. And I think all these aspects should be considered when we talk about, for example, extending the use of environmental taxes and of carbon taxes in general. Let me finally just briefly mention the most important elements or levers of a sustainability-oriented design of public finances. I think one important element is the extension of environmental taxes. Another important element is the dismantling of environmentally harmful subsidies. We should try to strengthen green subsidies and green investment. We should also strengthen, also from an environmental perspective, wealth-based taxes. And what would be also useful, or what could be also useful from a green perspective, is to dismantle tax barriers for a more equal division of paid and unpaid work between men and women, because this may support a more sustainable consumption patterns. And all these cornerstones of greening public finances, of course, have a very relevant gender dimension. And I at least miss more also empirical work on these gender dimensions. My third area, very, very briefly, but as I said before, I want to mention it because it's a very topical issue at the moment, is gender and fiscal consolidation. This graph, which I took from a paper from Perrivier from 2018, I adapted it a bit, maybe some of you know it already. It illustrates that the various categories of austerity policy have severe gendered effects. Yeah? If we increase taxes, that affects incentives and also this degree of distribution through the tax system. If we cut public services, that may have sex segregation effect at the labor market, and it may also lead to less defamiliarization and decommodification. If we cut social protection, that may imply reduced social citizenships and also reduced social rights. And if we cut equality policies, that may impair the monitoring of gender equality and also women's rights. So overall, fiscal consolidation may lead to welfare state distortions and maybe also possibly to an uncontrolled destabilization of gender regimes. So I think it's of utmost importance to take into account gender aspects when designing fiscal consolidation measures. That this is not always taken into account. We see at the moment in many EU countries that are implementing fiscal consolidation measures, including the country where I'm residing, Austria at the moment. So gender aspects have not played a very important role in the public debate and also in the design of fiscal consolidation measures. And on the other hand, many of the fiscal consolidation measures that will be implemented now in Austria have a very well, let's say, probably heavy impact on gender equality. So very briefly, and this is my last slide, let me close by pointing out some research gap. I miss very heavily gender in the debate on how to tax high net wealth individuals. This debate has become very prominent also on an international level, and I think it's important, and I think it's a good thing that this debate is so topical at the moment, but gender aspects are completely missing in this debate. Gender aspects are also completely missing in the emerging and very interesting, also empirical literature that is exploring the behavioral responses and the distributional effects of wealth-based taxes. We have almost no empirical results regarding gender-differentiated incidents of corporate taxation. I mentioned that before. I miss gender in environmental and carbon taxation and environmental and climate policies. In general, I dearly miss gender in environmentally harmful and green subsidies. These are so important issues. There's no gender at all. Yeah? Nobody cares about gender in all these important debates. And also rigorous ex post analysis of fiscal consolidation measures that have been implemented in the past and from which we could learn a lot, I think, from a gender perspective are missing. So thank you very much. I hope I didn't take too much time. And
excellent. Many thanks.
Look forward to the discussion.